Welcome, and I know that today's kind of we're at the tail end of the sessions here. I really appreciate you all sticking through the whole program and showing up today. My name is Ron Cully. I'm the Senior Program Manager, Product Manager on Directory Service at AWS, and we'll get started. Okay, so what we're going to do today in this session is we're going to talk a little bit about how is AD used. It's kind of context setting, and then we'll talk a little bit about deployment options, because how many people here today are using Active Directory in the cloud? Fair amount of you. How many people are that didn't raise their hands? How many of you have AD on premises right now? Okay, most all of you. And you're looking for ways to find out how to work with the cloud, maybe move to the cloud. Okay, great. So we're going to cover a little bit of context about how AD is used, deployment options for how to get AD into the cloud, how that works with AWS applications and so forth, how to choose, what are the considerations of, do I choose a managed service or do I put AD on an EC2 instance? And then we're going to also talk a little bit about trusts and synchronization as alternatives for replication. Okay, so first let's talk about how AD is used, why it's important in the cloud. So back in February, Gartner Group did a report, and it was called Implementing an Identity Strategy for Amazon Web Services. And in that report, they talked about how companies are moving to the cloud by refactoring a lot of applications. So they're kind of looking at the right-hand side of this picture here, where they get these services built and make them more native in a cloud environment. But there's a whole bunch of applications and services that are on premises today that are dependent upon Active Directory. And there's an opportunity in the process of getting to the refactoring phase to move those workloads to the cloud and get benefits of the cloud and reduce your infrastructure costs. So I thought that was an interesting slide that I'd share that with you. Now, in terms of how AD works, this is probably old hat to many of you. You've got computers that come up on the network, they domain join, they do their authentication, they get their GPOs to configure the machine. The machine provides LDAP services for applications. A user comes in, they authenticate into the network, they're authenticating into Active Directory, they get their group membership, they get their login scripts, they get a Kerberos ticket, and then they can use that Kerberos ticket to access other services, in this example, SQL Server. And their SQL Server uses the Kerberos ticket to do the authorization against the directory. Now, as we've moved more and more toward the cloud, we start to see applications that come into play. Might have an application that needs to work with federated users out in the internet, and they're using SAML authentication. So the application might have its own database that's down here in the right corner of this AppDB, and that's just a database that is storing all these users that are doing SAML authentication. But the application might also need to gain access to services like SQL Server, and it needs a way of authenticating against SQL Server. So the application itself has its own Kerberos ticket. And so there's a lot of use of Kerberos and Active Directory in our environments today. And the tricky part is what happens when you start shifting all these things into the cloud. Maybe you're using EC2 instances for the Windows instances instead of desktops. Maybe you're using workspaces as an example for VDI. You might be using DynamoDB to house user identities that are being used for an application that's doing SAML authentication. You might be using RDS for Microsoft SQL Server as the SQL Server store. So how do you put that all together? So we're going to talk a little bit about this now. We're going to talk about the different options that you've got. And the first option you've got is you could run AD on your on-premises network and use that and have the cloud devices coming from the cloud down to your on-premise network. That's one model. So here you would create a VPN or a direct connect link to your VPC. You would manually domain join the EC2 instances to your on-premises network and use your VPC kind of as an extension of your network. But there's some security considerations you got to make sure you look at here, because you're going to have to open up a lot of ports from the cloud down to your on-premises network. And many people think that that's not necessarily the best security practice to have. There's also some latency considerations, because you now have these cloud resources that you're running up there, and they now have to traverse across this wide area network to get to your on-premises network and use your AD. So that is an option. It's possible to do that. Second option is you can run Active Directory on EC2 instances in the cloud. So you manage this in this case, and so your responsibilities are that you would have to make sure you have an availability strategy. So what happens if an instance fails? How are you going to make sure that you've got redundancy and failover types of things? You're going to have to configure the EC2 instances and look at your DNS configuration. You have to manage your sites and services. You've got to do monitoring, recovery, backup, restore. You have to configure the AWS security groups. These are not to be confused with the Active Directory security groups. A little bit of a name conflict there, but manual EC2 domain joining, you're gonna have to do that as well because there's not a way for EC2 to do what we call seamless domain join. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you also have to figure out, well, what are you gonna do about patch management when all the patches come out or the next big vulnerability happens? How are you gonna update those systems? So there's a lot of work involved in putting AD on an EC2 instance. And then if you do choose to do that, and you want to use some Amazon applications like maybe you want to use Workspaces as a VDI solution, or you want to use Workdocs or Chime or Connect or something like that, those services require that you have the AWS directory services because they use directory services as a way to reach Active Directory. And so you'd still need to have that in your environment. The third way is you could use the managed service from Amazon, the AWS directory service for Microsoft Active Directory Enterprise Edition. Short name there. We'll just call it AWS Microsoft AD for the rest of the session here. Now, if you use AWS Microsoft AD, and I'm going to even shorten that further if you'll allow me, I'll just call it Managed AD. So if you use Managed AD, then what it's fairly straightforward to do. First, we're running Windows 2012 R2 as the domain controllers. These are dedicated domain controllers. They are yours. Nobody else shares any resources on those systems at all. It takes about 3 clicks to set this up. So you go in and you enter in what your domain name is. You have an administrative password you have to set up. You tell it which VPC you want, and if you just do those 3 things, that's pretty much all you got to do. Click OK, and we create 2 domain controllers that are in different availability zones. So you have a highly available Active Directory that's in your VPC with that kind of a setup experience. Now, you can choose to use these either as standalone directories in the cloud, or you can connect it to your existing on-premises directory with a trust. And we'll talk a bit about trusts later. And then in terms of AWS applications, you can use this with EC2 and take advantage of seamless domain join. Seamless domain join allows you, when you are setting up your EC2 instance, you just say, yeah, see that directory I created over there? I want you to join to that. And it just does all the work for you. You don't have to do anything manual. So that's a pretty nice feature. This is because when we set up the directory, EC2 has the ability to see that as a resource. Now, if you had your own AD on your own EC2, EC2 would not be able to see that, but if you go into the instance, you can see it in the network and you can do a normal domain join like you would with any AD environment. But the seamless domain join can be a little bit more streamlined for you. It also works with RDS for SQL Server. RDS SQL Server uses it for authentication and authorization. It works with Workspaces, QuickSight, Chime. It also works with Connect, Workdocs, Workmail. There's quite a few of our applications are now working with the Managed AD product. Now, in terms of constraints, I want to make sure that this isn't a panacea Active Directory for you, and I want to make sure that I'm clear about that. One thing about Active Directory is that when it was created, you got to remember this is back in the 90s, and the administrators and the operators were pretty much the same people. There was no distinction between someone who would do operational management of things and who did the root user of the system. And so because we're managing this service and we're providing the backup recovery, all the things that we do, we have to be the domain admins on this. And if we're the domain admins, and that causes a little bit of a challenge of what permissions can we give to you, because if we have that conflict, then there can be a degradation of the service. The service could be completely knocked offline. We can't really deliver an SLA around it. So what we do is we give you an organizational unit, and we delegate you as the admin over the organizational unit. And so you have full power over that OU, and then we have the domain admin so that we can do the job that we do. And let's see. Then in terms of the apps and services, like if you're going to be using seamless domain join, if you're going to be using workspaces, workdocs, those things, you have to have the directory in the same VPC as where those resources are. Now we also started out when we got going on this, we released the product and we wanted to be really careful about the security model or the security posture we had with the service. We had to really be careful about that. So we took a very conservative approach up front, and there were very few things that you could do as an administrator. And we're gradually adding more and more capabilities to that as we understand the detail and nuance about making those things possible. So sometimes you might find an application that doesn't work because it needs some permissions that you're not able to delegate to that application because you don't have domain admin permissions. So what we're looking for is trying to find our ways to enable more of that. So some examples of that would be, we didn't have the ability to do schema extensions until like last November. When we first came out, it required permissions to do that, and we had to figure out the model for doing that. Because that was a pretty privileged operation, what we did is we put a user interface in front of it and an API in front of that. And that allows us to kind of take your request to do the extensions, and we can digest that and figure out how that fits together, and we can put that, and we can implement that, rather than just opening it up and having you hit the domain controller and possibly bringing it down. And there are also a few administrative functions that are unavailable. An example of something that we just enabled was fine-grained password policy. So until about July 6th, you didn't have the ability to go in and change the password policies. It was the default password policies of the system. So you might find a few of those things here and there. Now, what we do is we operate the system. So we make sure we've got domain controllers in multiple availability zones. We do the patching, the monitoring, the recovery, the snapshot, the restore. What your responsibilities are is to administer the users, the groups, and the computers, set the GPO policies, those kinds of things. Now, so what I want to do now is talk a little bit about if you have managed AD or you set up AD in the cloud on an EC2 instance, what are the options that you've got available for connecting to your existing on-premises Active Directory? So one model is replication. And in this case, you've got your on-premises directory, you've got your users that are there. Maybe you're just trying to extend that environment into the cloud. And what you can do if you have AD running on an EC2 instance is that you can have it be part of the same domain, and then it's replicating. So you've got a full copy of your directory up in the cloud. Now that will work only if they're your own DCs. And the reason that you can't do that with a managed AD is that in order for that to work, you'd have to be domain admins, we'd have to be domain admins. And that creates a little bit of a security challenge for us. The other way you can do this is you can use a one-way or a two-way trust. In this model, we'll talk more about trusts later. How many people are familiar with trusts? Most of you, okay, great. So you can use a one-way or two-way trust. And this model works with AD running on EC2 Windows, or it runs with the managed AD product as well. And then the third thing that you can do is you could synchronize users from your on-premises directory into AD in the cloud. And this will be dependent upon a third-party tool. We don't provide one of those tools, but there are some people that provide tools like this out there. And we'll talk more about those as we move along. I want to give some examples of what this looks like. If you were to use your on-premises Active Directory and have all of your resources in the cloud join your on-premises network, it would look something like this. And the red line is where all the LDAP and the authentication and authorization functions are happening. So you can see that the instances up in the cloud, we've got web, application, database. Those things are all going back across the direct connector VPN link to your on-premises domain controllers. And then as far as application traffic, if you have users and admins, they want to go up and use the services in the cloud, then they're using the blue dotted lines are kind of the application protocols that are going up to those applications. So that's the way that looks. If we look at AD on an EC2 instance, it looks something like this. The green line could either be a trust or it could be replication. And so you get to decide which way you want that to work. And so if you're using replication, you're going to reduce the amount of traffic that happens across the direct connect and VPN link. You're going to have replication that goes up to the cloud, but the web application and database instances in the cloud are going to use the red dotted line to get to your AD in the cloud and do all of the authentication and authorization up there. And then if you have users in the on-premises network that need to access resources in the cloud, because you've got this replicated or trust environment, those users can access them and they get the same single sign-on experience that you're used to seeing in your on-premises network. So that's what it looks like with AD running on a EC2 instance. The next example is if you're using the AWS Microsoft AD with a trust to your on-premises network. It looks similar except that we have our own area that we've put the domain controllers and we make them available as IP endpoints. They're static IP addresses, so they never change for you. We do have them in different availability zones. There's one DC in each of 2 availability zones. And then they're using a trust back to your on-premises network. And so if you have users that want to use the resources, they go up and access the web or the application services along that blue path. Those web and application instances are then using the cloud-based Active Directory to do the authentication and the LDAP queries. Now, if an authentication comes along in the cloud, then if the users are not in the domain controller in the cloud, then we use the normal trust-based referral model to send them back down to the on-premises network for the authentication portion. But once we have the Kerberos ticket because of the trust, also we just can use the Kerberos ticket in the cloud and we don't have to do as much back and forth across your VPN or Direct Connect links. The next model I'm going to touch on is if you're using AD in the cloud and you're using synchronization. So in this model, what you're doing is there's no connection between the domain controllers in the cloud and the domain controllers on-prem, except for a box that sits between them. You can see it in the kind of the bottom left corner where it says password changes. So you have a box there that runs a synchronization feature that gets users and possibly passwords and sends those up into the cloud. And the challenge with the passwords is that you can't really synchronize passwords easily. So what happens is you synchronize the users and you end up changing how you do password changes for users. They end up going to a web page and then the web page synchronizes to both places. And so now you've got the same identities in 2 different directories, but you don't get a single sign-on experience. The users that are inside the network in your on-premises network, if they want to go up and access the cloud, they actually have to do an authentication against the Active Directory that's in the cloud, even though it's the same username and the same password. They have to do that because the Kerberos tickets are not trusted between the 2 networks. So I either get to use resources in the cloud or I get to use resources in the corporate network, but I can't do both. And I'll give some examples of why you might want to do that and why you wouldn't want to do that. All right, so let's talk about considerations for the applications and services. All right, if you're using AWS applications like Connect or Chime or QuickSight, WorkDocs, WorkMail, or something like that, then you want to do that with users that are in your on-premises Active Directory today, or maybe you have AD that is on EC2 in the cloud, and you've got users there, then you need to you need to stand up Microsoft AD, the AWS Microsoft AD, in the cloud and create a trust to your existing domain controllers. That's the only way that we can do the authentication and authorization stuff that we need to do. Now, if you're doing that, they need to be in the same VPC or the same account. So in the case of QuickSight, it needs to be in the same account. Now, if you're looking at, well, how do I do my billing if I've got multiple accounts? How do I deal with that? There's kind of two options that you can do. One option is that, which is the least cost and has the fewest number of trusts, is to deploy AWS Microsoft AD in one VPC and set up a trust, and that we have only one trust to deal with. And then you deploy all of your applications, RDS SQL Server, Workspaces, QuickSight, whatever, in the same VPC and same account. And then you use tagging on those the applications to do your internal billing. So that's one way of doing it. That way reduces the number of Microsoft ADs you have to buy in the cloud. The second option simplifies the billing, but it makes the trust configuration more complicated and higher cost. In this case, you put the AWS Microsoft AD in every single VPC where you have applications, and then you create a trust from each one of those domain controller, or each one of those forests to your on-premises network. And that might work fine if you've got just a couple of VPCs, but if you get 100 VPCs, you could imagine setting up 200 ends of the trusts and the cost of 200 copies of that. So the option one might be a lower cost option for you to look at. All right, so how to choose which approach to take. We're going to cover that right now. First, let's take a look at the deployment differences. From an operational perspective, AWS Microsoft AD is an AWS managed service, so you don't have as much work to do. All those things that I talked about earlier that are your responsibilities if you're setting up AD on an EC2 instance, we take care of almost all of that. The other two cases where it's on premises or in the cloud, you have to do all that management work. From an availability standpoint, when you start up the Microsoft AD, the managed AD product, we built in the redundancy, so you don't have anything to do. We take care of the replication. We stand up the instances in different availability zones. We do, like I said, we do the patching and all of that for you as well. In the case of the other two, you have to do your own design for the availability and make sure you get that all sorted out. For networking, if you're using a trust, you have the fewest number of ports that you have to open between your on-premises network and the cloud. And so that's a plus for using a trust model. There are some constraints around trust models, but that's one benefit from a security standpoint. If you're using AD on an EC2 instance, you get the choice of using a trust or using replication. So you get to choose that. And if you're using your on-premises network, you pretty much have to open everything up. And so that's something where you're going to be the most exposed if you're using that way. For administrative control, we give you that OU that you manage all your users in with AD running on an EC2 instance. You have full control over how you architect your directory, how many child domains you have, how you organize all of that. So you do have to live within a few constraints if you're using the AWS Microsoft AD product. Okay, let's take a look at some other considerations. So, what are your top level goals that you're looking at? If you're trying to minimize your cost and effort to run AD in the cloud, the AWS Microsoft AD product can be a really good option because you don't have to do all of the management overhead involved. If you want to run RDS for SQL Server and use that in your environment, then you have to use AWS Microsoft AD. If you want to use AWS enterprise applications like Chime and Connect and those types of things, then you need to use the AWS Microsoft AD. And if you want to run Windows workloads on EC2 and have them work with your Active Directory, you can do a lot of applications. We recently enabled SharePoint, SQL Server Always On availability groups, and additional .NET applications by making it possible to set up service accounts and do managed service accounts using the AWS Microsoft AD product. And also do Kerberos constrained delegation is another feature that we enabled. So you can run a lot of applications on the service. Back a few months ago, it wasn't the case, but today there's a lot of applications you can run. When would you want to use EC2 as your AD platform? Well, one is if you required a replicated directory in the cloud. If you want more than just trust, then you would want to do that. If you need NetBIOS support to support old applications, and hopefully you don't need to do that, then you would need to do that because we don't support NetBIOS. There's a lot of security issues around the NetBIOS protocol. And then if you needed permissions that we have not yet delegated to you to run certain applications, then you would want to run AD on an EC2 instance to support those applications. Some examples of that would be Exchange. It has a lot of complexity in order to install that, and we currently don't support that on the managed product. And also ADFS, if you need to use ADFS, then that would be another reason. Those are things that we're looking at. Let's also take a look at the connection models that are involved here and which one to use. For application access, if you want single sign-on to the cloud, then you want to use a trust model or a replication model. If you're trying to do synchronization, you don't get SSO. You get the same user identity to log in with, so I call it kind of same sign-on, not single sign-on. If you're looking for complexity and effort, if you're looking at EC2 seamless domain join, it's the easiest if you're using the managed product. If you are looking at your domain controller configuration, the one that has the probably the highest complexity is if you're using Active Directory on EC2 with synchronization, that's going to be a lot of effort. There's a lot of work to do there. The lowest is going to be the Microsoft AD. Incremental maintenance, it's very low to do maintenance on the managed product. We take care of that for you. But if you're using a synchronization product that's from a third party, there's a lot you have to think through about how do I synchronize my users? How am I going to map the users I've got in my existing on-premises network to this organizational unit structure in the cloud? And then I've got to make sure that I tell my users how to change their passwords by using a web page to go to and change that so it gets changed in both places. And so there's a bit more work to do there. And also if you're doing the entitlements, so setting up who can access what, how do I set up my permissions in the cloud versus on the on-premises network? It's the lowest if you're using a trust, or if you're using replication, there's nothing special that you have to do. If you're using synchronization, there's a lot. Now let's talk about the difference on replication versus trust. In a trust model, what you have to do is create groups in the trusting side of the connection, and then you take your trusted side of the world, put those users or groups into the trusting side of the network groups. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I've got a picture that shows that in a few minutes. If you're using replication, you don't have to worry about that because all your groups and users are in both places at once. And so you just start setting your entitlements based upon your existing structures. You don't have to create additional groups and add people to that. So that helps you kind of understand how trusts and synchronization and replication affect the complexity of managing things. So let's talk about trusts. And then I think I'm trying to make sure I leave enough time that we can ask questions. I've got a microphone here, and I want to make sure I answer as many questions as I can. So, all right, so let's talk about this. First, let's talk about some of the feedback that we've heard from customers about, well, maybe we should use synchronization instead of trust. And one of the things I've said is, well, why is that? And many of them say, well, it's kind of scary. We've got, many admins, even seasoned AD admins, are not that familiar with how trusts really work and how to secure them. And so that unknown creates some discomfort. Perception that trust gives all cloud resources access to on-premises domains. I've talked to a number of AD administrators who thought that if I just open up this trust, then suddenly You know, Amazon has this domain admin privilege in the cloud. It has full access over my directory in the on-premises network, which is not true, but that's a perception that many people have had. Another perception is that trusts give the cloud in, well, I guess it's kind of the same. It gives, Amazon would have access to your resources and have access to your directory and control it, but that just isn't the case. And we'll talk a bit more about what you do get and you don't get and how to secure trust in a few minutes. One consideration is trust requires setup coordination. So I've got to get a security review from the security team. I've got to get firewall ports open, and I've got to do trust setup. And so I don't want to use a trust. I want to use synchronization. We still have to do security reviews. You still have to do firewall ports, and you still have to set up a synchronization tool. So make sure that you're looking at both things and weighing them evenly. You know, it's really quick to kind of do the knee-jerk. Well, trusts are going to be hard to do. You know, I'll have a lot of red tape to go through. There's a lot of people to talk to. You still have the same thing to do with synchronization. Another consideration is that it breaks the principle of communication initiation only from the on-premises to the cloud, because now I've got the cloud coming to the on-premises. Well, it kind of sort of does, but not really. The only thing it's doing there is it's directing the authentications to your on-premises network. But other than that, everything stays in the cloud. So trusts are not as bad as what a lot of people think they are. They can be done in a safe way. The key question is it a one-way or a two-way trust? One-way trust, typically what you do is you have the cloud trust your on-premises network, and then the on-premises can access the cloud. Now, there is a case where you need to have two-way trust, and I'll talk about why that is in just a minute. Now, another thing that we've gotten of why people are interested in synchronization is that we're isolating our on-premises network from the cloud, and we need just a few users in the cloud, and we want them to use the same user identity. So examples of this is a company that produces an application that is available to their customers on the web, and they don't want their internal employees to go up and have access to any of that infrastructure because it's part of your business. You're delivering a service online. So you only want the administrators of that service to have access to the resources in the cloud. And your employees who are doing your day-to-day business work, they stay on-prem. So that's actually a practical reason why you might want to use synchronization. So let's take a look at considerations that you want to think through if you're going to move towards synchronization. First, do your on-premises users need access to the cloud resources? So if I'm going to have my on-premises users accessing some application in the cloud, then they're going to have to log into the cloud separately from on-premises. So if I've logged into my on-premises AD, I'm in my domain, I'm using all my resources, I've got Exchange there, I'm using all of that. Now I want to access this web application in the cloud. When I go up there, my Kerberos ticket isn't any good anymore. So I have to log out of my on-premises network. I got to log into the cloud in order to get a Kerberos ticket that's valid for using those things. So I don't get that single sign-on experience. So that's something you really want to think about, how your users are going to react to that. The other thing to consider is it is a third-party synchronization tool that you'll need to figure out how to get that into your network. I can't recommend any of them. I don't have any to recommend. That's something you'll have to research. They will require some special configuration for what you synchronize from your on-premises network to the cloud. And you're going to have to map them from your on-premises domains to the OU structure that's in the cloud. So there's some work to do there. And then if you're going to use a synchronization tool with the managed AD product, you've got to make sure that it doesn't require domain admin permissions, because that's not something that you have access to. So any of the user creation that is done in the cloud needs to run in the context of the admin account that we give to you that can add users to the OU that we give to you as part of that product. Make sense? All right, the other thing to think through is that sync does add some configuration complexity. It adds some latency for managing your users. So let's say I add a user to my on-premises network today, then there's a latency of when the synchronization is going to occur to the cloud so that the user is available there. So just something to consider. And I also have to think through the entitlements. How do I set up permissions for the user in the cloud? Because I've got to set up their permissions in my on-premises Active Directory, and now I've got to go to the cloud, and with this synchronized user, now add them to the right groups in the cloud and make sure that they've got their entitlements set up. And then yeah, so I've got pretty much covers that slide. Okay, so this is a picture of what it looks like if you're doing synchronization, and I would call this an appropriate use. Let's say I've got an application in the cloud. It's maybe a B2C type of application, so the consumers are coming in using SAML authentication to get to my application, and I need an AWS resource administrator who can control the application that's running in the cloud. And the admins that are going up into the cloud, they don't want to remember a separate identity to log in up in the cloud to manage those resources. So in that case, it makes some sense to do synchronization into AD so that the administrator, who's kind of in the middle, little gray guy up there in the middle, that they can log in. This is an example that may not make as much sense. You've got all your on-premises users. They want to access SharePoint, Exchange, .NET, other things that are in the cloud, and they're also accessing resources in your on-premises network. If you're trying to do this, it's going to get really frustrating for the users because they have to remember where they're going and do they have to log out and which domain do they have to log into. So that can be kind of an ugly problem. So something to really think through. So let's talk about forest trusts. The managed AD product supports forest trusts today. It doesn't support external domain trusts at the moment. It does support forest trusts. Now, in these models, you've got a trust has a direction. So there's a trusting side and a trusted side. And the direction of access is opposite of the trust. So if in the cloud you had a managed AD up in the cloud, and it trusts your on-premises network, it means your on-premises users can go and access resources in the cloud using the Kerberos credential that they got when they logged into your on-premises network. Now, this is a pretty time-tested and secure model. It's been used for years. It was available very early on when Active Directory first shipped. The trusting forest has no administrative control over the trusted forest. It's trusting users that are coming from the trusted forest. It doesn't have any rights to go into the other trusted forest at all. The trusted users have access to the cloud resources only if they're entitled to by the trusting admins. So a user on the right side can't go access a resource on the left side unless someone gave them permissions in the left side. And in the case of using managed AD, you get to control both sides. So you get full control over who does what there. Now, the resources that are in the cloud, they don't have any access to the on-premises resources unless the on-premises trusts the cloud. So that means you've got to have a two-way trust involved. And the on-premises admins grant permission to the user identities that are in the cloud. So it means you have to have a two-way trust, and both sides have to set up access. If you don't do that, then there's no access from the cloud into your on-premises network. The only thing you get when you have a two-way trust, let's say that was a two-way trust, the managed AD side can read the directory in your on-premises network. And so if you have applications in the cloud that need to provision users, it has to know about the users that are in your on-premises network. You have to have a two-way trust to do that. There are only two other ways it could be done. One is if there was a user account in your on-premises network that had read permissions that the application used to read the users and provision itself. That's one way. Or the other way is you have to do a export of your users from your on-premises network into like a CSV file and import them into the application. So a two-way trust can really help simplify the process. Now, if you have a trust, what you typically do is you create an Active Directory security group, not an AWS security group, which is a networking firewall kind of thing, but a security group in Active Directory. And that's where you set up the entitlements for what the users can do with the resources in the cloud. Then what you can do is take your on-premises users and add them to the security groups in the cloud, and those users now have access to those resources. But a more efficient way of doing that is to take and create security groups in your on-premises network, add your users to the security groups in your on-prem network, and then take the security group from your on-premises network and add them to the security group that's in the cloud. That way, you can set up your relationship between your on-premises security group and your cloud security group one time, and then when you onboard your new employees and people are coming and going, all you're doing is managing their access by changing their membership in the on-premises security groups. Make sense? So that's the way you want to do things with a trust model. All right, so now, do you use no trust, one-way, or two-way? Well, if you don't have users that need access from one forest to the other, then don't do trust. Just set them up as separate directories. If you can get by with a one-way trust, then only use a one-way trust. It reduces the surface area of attack. RDS SQL Server, as an example, only needs a one-way trust. It doesn't need a two-way trust. It's just accepting the Kerberos ticket that the users got from their on-premises network, and then it does the authorization against the security group that you've set up in the managed AD in the cloud. If a two-way trust is required, then that's the time to use the two-way trust. So examples there are Workspaces, QuickSight, Enterprise Edition, and Chime. They use the two-way trust in order to provision users into those applications. So they have to have a way of, if you want to say, well, I want to create a workspace for Jane, then I have to be able to see Jane's user identity in the on-premises network. And we don't have any read permissions with a one-way trust where we trust you. We have to have you trust us enough that we can go in and read that directory. Once we do the provisioning of the user, that's the only thing we are using that second path for. Once we've provisioned the user, then we only use the one-way trust from the cloud to your on-premises network to trust the Kerberos tickets of the users that are coming up to the cloud. And you can always secure these, and we recommend you do secure your trust. So how do you secure trust? Well, first thing is that by default, Active Directory has a thing called SID filtering. And SID filtering, in the life cycle of a user may have multiple security IDs as they progress through life. And all of their SID history is kept so that they can gain access to things that had given the old SID permissions to a resource. Well, when you cross a trust boundary, you really don't want your old SIDs to cross that boundary. You want only your current one, because your current one is active, and it can only exist in the current domain. So if someone were to get your SID history in the other forest, they could create a user account, stuff the SID in there, and try and go to your on-premises network and break in. By doing SID filtering, only the current SID goes to the cloud, and if someone from another forest tried to use that same SID and come into your forest, then the security of Active Directory blocks them. So you want to leave SID filtering on. Just don't ever turn SID filtering off when you're doing forest trust. It's on by default. Second thing is turn on selective authentication in the on-premises side of the trust. What selective authentication does is it says that if I'm a user in the cloud and I try to go to your on-premises network, let's say you trusted the cloud, I can't even talk to the resources in the network to try and do anything unless I have been given permissions to access a resource already. So it prevents any attempts of authentication and access to resources in a network if you've got selective authentication on. So what you want to do is turn on selective authentication. And if you're using, as an example, Workspaces or Chime, you'll see inside of the directory in Managed AD, you'll see some user accounts that we've created for Chime and for Workspaces. Those are the accounts that we use to read your on-premises directory to provision the users. So if you just enable those user accounts to have permissions to your domain controllers for the purposes of reading, then no other users from the cloud can go into your network. Just those application identities can go in to read the directory. So that can really help secure things. And then only permit AD trust ports to the DCs in the cloud. So you just reduce your surface area. If you need, we have static IPs on the domain controllers that we've set up in managed AD. And so you know the addresses. Just make sure you only allow Active Directory traffic to those IP addresses, and that will help to reduce surface area as well. And then if you have clients in the cloud, so a cloud client to AD. So an example would be, let's say I've got workspaces in the cloud, and it needs to authenticate the user to your on-premises directory. Then you want to make sure you only permit the AD authentication ports to your on-premises AD. Don't open up the whole world. Just make sure you open up enough of the ports to let workspaces do its authentication. And so there's I've got references here, and I believe these slides are going to be available after the event, so you'll be able to get a hold of these, and you'll be able to use these links to find out more information on these topics. And then the last thing is, don't grant groups in the cloud access to on-premises resources. That prevents any rogue people in the cloud from adding user accounts to a security group in the cloud and gaining access to on-premises resources. If you follow these things, then you can have a pretty secure environment with a two-way trust. All right, so I'm going to recap, and then we'll open it up for questions. We've got about 14 minutes left here. So we talked a little bit about there's a lot of different ways that you can use AD in the cloud. If you use AD on EC2 and managed AD, you get some advantages over using it in using your on-premises network. Advantages in terms of security, in terms of performance, reliability, all those kinds of things. AD on EC2 is appropriate when you need to have full domain admin permissions or you need a replicated directory in the cloud. The managed AD product is appropriate if you want to support resources in the cloud but have your user identities in your on-premises network. And it's also required if you're going to be using AWS applications like Workspaces or Chime or Connect or those kinds of things. And trusts are secure and appropriate when you need to use a single sign-on model to go from on-premises into Active Directory dependent workloads that are running in the cloud to get that single sign-on experience. And synchronization can be appropriate for isolated cases where you have a small number of users in your on-premises network that need access into the cloud. So that kind of recaps what we talked about today. There are some additional references here. We've got some documentation on Active Directory at the Amazon.com directory service area. We have some quick starts. I'd encourage you to take a look at the quick start site. There's some really interesting things there about Active Directory domain services and running those in the cloud, Exchange Server and how to set that up, SharePoint. We're working to add more information on those, on how to set up SharePoint with managed AD now that we support SharePoint there, and SQL Server always on availability groups. So there's some really good tools in the quick start area. So at this point, what I want to do is open it up for questions. We've got about 12 minutes left. Any questions? Yeah, if you do me a favor, could you step up? There's a mic here in the middle, and that way we capture that on the recording for other people to benefit from.
Hi.
Hi.
So what are the challenges with moving from AD on-prem to AWS AD? From one thing I understand is that group policy, that you would have to translate all of those to like whatever the term is at AWS.
Yes. When you set up, there is a different OU structure in the cloud than you probably have in your on-premises network. And you do have to take your GPOs and move them to the cloud, and that does require some work to do. If you're going to be managing, if you want the same policies to be used to manage the EC2 instances and the users. That's true.
So are there any other bullet point summaries that you could give? Because I researched a little bit of this, and my decision was we would go into a hybrid configuration initially and then take some more time and then go to AWS.
No,
but are there any instances, I guess, for a medium to large size organization where you would move, directly to AWS and be aggressive in that path, to save money or
right?
whatever
Yeah,
reason?
it does take a little bit longer, and I would agree with your assessment that a hybrid IT type model is the best way to start because it gives you time to do planning and move things. Sometimes the structure that you have in your on-premises directory might be more complex than they really need to be. And back years ago, everybody used a lot of different child domains, and they had all these complex structures. And as they grew, people started realizing a flat directory is a lot easier than a really broad directory with a lot of that complexity. And so what some people do is they tend to stay with their on-premises network. They start to work out getting to a flat structure in their existing on-premises network, and then as they get to the flat structure, then it ports easier to the cloud because you've got this OU in the cloud and you're dealing with kind of a flat movement. And and so it gives you time to adjust your GPOs, move things around, get them structured so that they would map better to the cloud and then move them to the cloud. So that can help, yes.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Yep.
Just looking for feedback on, RDS for SQL Server, the only way to allow authentication from an on-prem directory structure is to stand up a managed instance in AWS, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And the reason for that is that they're delivering a managed solution, and if that managed solution were domain joined to your network, then because you have domain admin permissions over it, then you can affect the operation of the service. And so they couldn't allow that model and still deliver the SLA they have. And so because we've done integration between the Active Directory that we provide as managed AD with RDS, and it's all AWS managed, then they can do that, and then through the trust, we can authenticate using the on-premises users.
So then second part of the question is, being that the managed service isn't multi-region aware, what's the response if you want to look to recover that RDS instance in a different region, and now that region doesn't have the knowledge of what trust was in place?
Yeah, so RDS actually requires that the managed AD be in the same VPC. It has that constraint right now. And so you would actually, if you're in a multi-region environment, you would have to have Microsoft Active Directory, the managed AD, in each of the regions with RDS, and each one of those directories has to have a trust to your on-prem directory.
All right.
Make sense?
Perfect. Yep.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
had a question. What did you mean when you said EC2 seamless domain join?
Okay, if you start up an EC2 instance through the user console, through the management console, you'll see an option there that identifies a directory, and you can say, yeah, I want to use that directory and join it, and it will enumerate all of the directory service directories that you have that it can see, and you can pick which one, and then it will automatically domain join that instance as it spins the instance up.
Now, you could still replicate that same type of functionality with like a PowerShell script that runs at launch, right? I mean,
Yeah, you can. You can do that. It's just, we made it simple to do because it's all integrated into EC2. But yes, you can. You'd have to write the PowerShell script. You'd have to make sure you've got the domain set up in the script, and you can run that. Yes, you can do that.
And then another question, based off customers you've dealt with that are larger, let's say 10,000 employees and over, what it seems to be, if there is one, the common practice? Are most customers putting separate domains in AD and doing trust, or are they extending their domain to AWS? Or, what are most people doing?
It's both. We have a lot of customers, large customers, that are adopting more and more services like RDS, and they're using the managed AD with the trust. And As we've grown the number of applications that we support in Managed AD, we've seen increasing interest in using Managed AD in the cloud to reduce the effort of managing AD on EC2 instances. And so we're seeing more and more people adopting that with the trust model.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Hello. What about leveraging AWS Microsoft AD for like the IAM roles or the console? You can't leverage this tool for that. Is that separate?
Okay, so yeah, I didn't actually talk about that, and thanks for bringing that up. We actually do support federation from Active Directory to the IAM roles with Managed AD. That also works if you have a trust set up to your on-premises network now. So what you do is once you've got your trust established, whether you have a trust or not, if you have all your users in Managed AD in the cloud, or whether you have them on-prem and you have a trust to your on-premises network, you can go in and enable this. You go to the Apps and Services page, and there's a place that says Enable AWS Management Console. Once you've done that, then you can go into a screen where you identify users in your on-premises network, and you can assign them to IAM roles. You can also do that with groups. And then anybody that's a member of those groups or those users, they can log into the AWS console using their on-premises credentials. Now, it does allow you to get into the console. The one thing that you don't get, that you do get if you use a SAML authentication model with IAM, is the tokens that are necessary for API and CLI access. You don't get that automatically with what we've done with Managed AD, but you do get console access.
Okay, very good, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We did a POC on AD connector a few years ago. Mm-hmm. What's the difference between that and what you're talking about now?
Okay, yeah, AD connector is a completely different model. What it does is, I talked earlier about the approach of using an on-premises user account so that applications can read the directory to provision the applications. That's what AD connector does. It doesn't use a trust. What it does is it supports only AWS applications. It doesn't work for anything else because there's an internal API structure that we have for for all the applications used to get into a directory. AD connector then proxies their LDAP queries using a user account that you create in your on-premises network. You get to control what scope of permissions it has in your on-premises network, which typically you leave it at create computer and read the directory. And so then those applications, when you're setting up workspaces, it can see the users and it can create the computer account. And then for authentication, when you go up, let's say I want to use Chime as an example. I have a URL that I go to for Chime, and it gives me a login page. I can type in my Active Directory credentials, and then that page passes those credentials through AD connector, and it proxies the authentication to your on-premises Active Directory and gets the Kerberos ticket back for Chime. So that's what AD connector does. It doesn't have any users in it. It doesn't have any trusts. It's just purely a proxy to support AWS applications.
So are you going to continue to support that eventually, or will it be deprecated in favor?
I can't really speak to long-term, plans that way. We support AD connector in a number of regions today. There are some of the newer regions that don't have AD connector. We've gotten feedback from some customers that they prefer to have the user account model for reading the directory rather than the two-way trust, and we're looking into that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any nuances with AD across the peering relationship between VPCs, and specifically, so there's dedicated DCs and a VPC. We have another VPC, but all our user accounts are in that AD, and we will have a peering relationship between our VPC and the VPC that has the Amazon DCs, not managed, but running in that. So any reason can we do permissions and things and authentication to machines in our VPC?
Yes, you can do Active Directory in a peered environment. That does work. Now, with some caveats. If you're trying to use the AWS applications, then peering doesn't work very well. It won't work at all for RDS SQL Server. It can work for EC2. It works probably the easiest if you have domain admin in complete control over that. The managed AD probably doesn't fit as well into a peered environment at this time. But yet you can make VPCs work. It's kind of a long discussion. Maybe we could talk afterwards.
Okay. And then a second question, is there any prohibition against having both? So you can have dedicated DCs in the cloud and then also be running the managed
Oh,
AD?
absolutely. Yeah, you can absolutely, you can have as many different ADs as forests as you want in your environment. And so you can have, what some people are doing is they're creating an AD on EC2 in the cloud that's replicated with their on-premises network. And then they set up the managed AD, and they do the applications, and they do EC2, and they use a trust model. And the reason that they had the AD in the cloud was to get replication so that if their VPN or their direct connect link went down for any reason, then they've got a complete copy of their on-premises directory in the cloud for the managed AD product to use. So there are people that do that. And there are also a number of people that, like doing, dev, test, and prod workloads. They've got, multiple directories in the cloud. Each one is their own separate thing, and even in the same VPC.
Right.
So yeah, you can do that.
Okay, thank you.
All right,
Oh, guess we're over time, so I'll step outside. If you want to catch me there, I can answer any questions there.